Good evening, everyone. We have some participants joining right now, so we'll start the webinar in a couple of minutes. We appreciate your patience. Okay, good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining the Community Commission for Public Safety and Accountability's webinar on CPD's draft traffic stop policy. My name is Nikki Garcia, and I serve as the Director of Public Affairs for the CCPSA. I'm joined tonight by my colleague, Cody Stevens, our Director of Policy Research and Planning, and we're also joined by Lieutenant Mike Kapistanik, who leads CPD's Policy and Development Division. So I will have them introduce themselves shortly. Julie, if you don't mind going to slide 2. Here's what you can expect in today's webinar. So CCPSA staff will begin with a brief overview of the timeline and policy development process, and then we will have Lieutenant Kapistanik present on CPD's draft traffic policy as is. After that, Director Stevens we'll share the commission's positions and recommendations. And then finally, we will open the floor to questions from attendees. We ask that all attendees use the Q&A chat feature. So if you have a question throughout the webinar, please feel free to drop it in the chat. And then once the webinar is completed, we'll do our Q&A portion.
Great. Thank you so much, Nikki. Thank you for joining us tonight. I'll just give a quick overview of, so as Nikki said, we're really using this webinar as an opportunity to provide information to community members about CPD's development of a new traffic policy, draft policy, and the commissioner's response to that draft policy. We also want to clarify the commission's role and let people know about, like I said, our responses to the current draft policy and how we've been working together on landing on language for that policy. And then we want to also use this as an opportunity to continue to gather feedback. The questions and comments people provide will help us inform further and future policy development. So the timeline, just giving people a little, there's been sort of two phases of traffic stop policy development. Phase one really has sort of goes even further back. The interim commission had been looking at traffic stops and had included traffic stops in their goals for CPD in the past. And then more recently, when the permanent commission came in, they started to look at other jurisdictions, started to ask about research, get community input around traffic stops. So they began collecting feedback both through listening sessions and through various online ways, whether people emailed or feedback forms, et cetera. And the commission and CPD really started to work in earnest on policy development around traffic stops. Phase one wrapped up with both CPD and the commission, CPD submitting a draft policy to the independent monitor who oversees the consent decree, and the commission submitted their response and a markup of that draft policy where there was majority commissioner consensus on different policy language. So we're really at the front end of phase two, which is kicking off with things like this community webinar. We're also looking to do more targeted engagements with folks that around the specific policy language. Of course, we will continue to work with CPD and continue to work with CPD around developing the policy. And then in this phase two, there's going to be some decision about whether traffic stops will fall into the consent decree or be covered by the consent decree. Julie, if you just go to the next slide, thank you. So just a little bit more about this. So the independent monitor for the consent decree, the Illinois Attorney General and the City of Chicago have been working to include traffic stops in the consent decree. That's been going on for a while. And while they've been doing that, the Commission and CPD have been working together on draft policy language. So those two processes have been going on in tandem. As I said earlier, on April 21st, and you'll see on both our website and CPD's website, CPD submitted a draft policy and the commission submitted both a response memo and a markup to the consent decree judge and the independent monitor. It should be noted that the commissioners support much of what's in the draft policy, although the majority commissioners support making some significant changes that we'll cover later. But it's worth noting there's a lot of ground in the policy that the commissioners support. So phase one, before we jump into, or before I turn it over to Lieutenant Kapustanic to talk about what is in CPD's current draft policy, just wanted to cover that some of the themes that were heard in the phase one community input. So it should be noted, the community feedback on stops has been wide ranging. We've gone all over the city in different areas and listened to different constituents and neighbors about their feelings about traffic stops more broadly. The phase one input was really about traffic stops more broadly. Phase two will be really more about the policy language. But in phase one, many residents raised concern about officer conduct, fairness of stop, the number of stops. People talked about stops eroding trust in CPD, particularly in communities that experience more frequent stops. We also heard from constituents support for traffic stops when used appropriately as an important public safety tool. So there were people who didn't want to see traffic stop. They wanted to see police being able to use traffic stops appropriately as a public safety tool. And then finally, sort of another theme around that we heard in phase one was really around ensuring that there was heightened accountability within a policy and within CPD around traffic stops, clearer standards within policy, more effective training, and better documentation with regards to traffic stops in particular. So I will turn it over to Lieutenant Kapustanic and he will run through the current draft policy. And then he'll hand it back to me and I'll talk about some of the majority commissioner positions around that, the current policy. Thanks, Mike. Go ahead.
Sure. Good evening, everyone. Really quick, my name is Michael Kapustanic, and I'm the Lieutenant Commanding Officer of the Chicago Police Department's Research and Development Division. The Research and Development Division is responsible for development of CPD policies, and that includes the work on developing the traffic stop policy. I'd like to thank the Commission for having me here today, and a big thank you to all the community members who have taken time out of their days to hear about CPD's traffic stop policy. We really appreciate these conversations, being able to present our policies and gathering the diverse opinions and feedbacks on those proposed policies. We do a lot of work in community engagement on our policies, and we appreciate all the efforts the community provides and all the feedback that we receive on the policies that we post or do efforts to engage the community on. Today's effort is for traffic stops, and I'll provide a quick summary of CPD's proposed traffic stop policy and highlight some significant components of that policy and where CPD and CCPSA have had discussions about in the development of that policy. First off, I wanted to provide a reminder that even CCPSA has on their website, their traffic stop site. CPD also has the policies posted on our draft policy website. It's on our CPD Transform page, which includes the policy reviews. On that page, we've got a quick summary of the efforts we've undertaken for the traffic stop policy. There's also a community-facing document that explains some of the efforts of the current traffic stop protocols, our current policies that are in place, some current stats on traffic stops. That document's there for your information to get a baseline on CPD's traffic stops. That website also includes the CPD traffic stop draft policy and the Commission's response to that draft policy. Our site is open till June 16th for comment. So you can just visit that site and you can provide feedback right on that site directly on any of those documents that are shared. Next slide, please. And really quick, this is that QR code to that draft policy page review, and that's going to be open for another week until June 16th. Next slide. So we're going to go really through today an outline of our traffic stop policy. We won't really get in depth. We'll do some high-level overviews of what CPD is expecting from these policies, but we're also want to give you some framework on this traffic stop policy. The traffic stop policy is drafted consistent with all other CPD policies. You can't look at CPD policies in a silo. They kind of layer on top of each other. We've got foundational policies that cover all interactions, that prohibit racial profiling, that guarantee the protection of human rights during all interactions. Those policies are still in place. This traffic stop policy is not going to eliminate the responsibilities CPD officers have in those other arenas, whether it's protection of human rights, prohibition of racial profiling, protection of religious freedoms, reporting and documented use of force, things of that nature. Those policies still remain, and you'll see a lot of those concepts contained within this traffic stop policy as well. This policy is also meant to be a suite of policies that cover all stops. Currently, right now, I know Cody identified that there's discussions on including traffic stops within the consent decree. Other investigatory stops are already included in the consent decree, and there was additional paragraphs added to the consent decree, and CPD is working through that process right now. And actually, there's a suite of policies called the Fourth Amendment and police encounters on our website now, the Department Directive System, which is available to the public at Chicago Police, directives.chicagopolice.org. And this fits into that suite of policies. We talk about investigatory stops and we talk about traffic stops. So it fits into that suite of policies about documentation, about review, about adhering to the Fourth Amendment when we're conducting traffic stops. So just wanted to provide a foundation that this isn't just a standalone policy. It's interwoven into many other concepts and policies. It doesn't stand as a silo. This policy in particular, we'll go through some of the sections. The first couple sections are general guidance and definitions to make sure as we're expressing our policy and we're articulating the expectations of our officers, not only to our officers, but what the community members can expect during traffic stops. We want to make sure everyone's talking about the same thing. So we have a definition section that defines some key terms on traffic stops. It defines a traffic stop, all those terms that we use within the policy so everyone's talking about the same thing. Then we talk general guidance about traffic stops, you know, the perceptions, how CPD uses traffic stops, how we want our officers to conduct themselves during traffic stops in kind of a general sense from a department perspective. And then we really get into kind of the policies and prohibitions. What efforts and activities do we expect during a traffic stop, and what things we want to prohibit officers from doing in a traffic stop. And it goes into, you know, making sure we have reasonable articulable suspicion or probable cause for that stop, making sure we're acting constitutionally, making sure we're not using race or other protected classification as a standard for that traffic stop. So we go into prohibitions, which we'll go into a little bit more detailed later. And then we get really into the meat of the interaction, which we heard a lot about in our community engagement activities, and through us participating with the commission on some of their efforts. We heard a lot about these interactions between officers and community members during traffic stops. And that's where the procedures really take hold, and we're really articulate and try to set forth the guidelines on how we want our officers to act and conduct themselves during that stop, which is focused on procedural justice, it's focused on respect, and it's focused on professionalism. And we set standards there, procedures there, to make sure that those standards are met and they're clearly articulated to our officers. But then we articulate three really key friction points we've identified in the procedure section about where we see the most friction between the conversations we've had with community. And that's removing people from vehicles, handcuffing people during traffic stops, and conducting consent searches during traffic stops. So we went above and beyond with the legal requirements there at CPD. We provided very prescriptive requirements in conducting those actions, and then communication and documentation of those actions as well. And then intermixed with that are the supervisory responsibilities. Obviously at CPD, we want supervisors to be supervisors and supervise their personnel when they're in the field, but they're also going to be reviewing those reports, the traffic stop reports that our officers complete for every traffic stop that they conduct. They're required to complete a report, and a supervisor is required to review that report and approve that report. And then we can go into more department level aspects of our policy. We talk about the department review and our commitment to analyzing our traffic stops, reviewing our traffic stops, publishing data about our traffic stops to make sure we're all having a very collaborative conversation about our use of traffic stops, our historical data on traffic stops, and how we can make the interactions and our traffic stop policy better. And that ties into our policy review. CPD is committed to reviewing this policy once implemented every 2 years to do a comprehensive review, which will include a look at that data, to look at those trends, to identify any concerns that are there, but also will include a community engagement effort, which will include our efforts for community engagement. It'll include the efforts of the CCPSA, and that we work collaboratively on this policy review to make sure it's still reflective of what we're hearing from the community. And then we've committed to training our officers. We can put a lot of language on paper, we can put a lot of language in policy, but really where the rubber meets the road is training those officers on how to comply with that policy, how to conduct themselves during stops. And that's really where the community is going to see the impact of these trained officers actually implementing and being accountable to the policies we put forth. Next slide, please. So we're going to go a little bit deeper into some of these sections that we've identified. You know, we've had a lot of conversations, some of the questions we've received in terms of during our community feedback. And one is the purpose of this policy. Why are we implementing a policy? We're implementing this policy because we don't have a specific specialized policy on traffic stops. Like I mentioned earlier, we have guidance on interactions with the community about prohibition of racial profiling and other actions. However, there isn't a specific prescriptive policy on conducting traffic stops. And layering on top of those other policies, we want to make sure that we articulate and that we give our officers the guidance when to conduct these traffic stops to make sure that we're complying with the Constitution and to make sure the rights of the public are guaranteed during these traffic stops, and that our officers are acting respectfully and professionally during these stops. Another key component we've had a lot of questions about is our definition section. What we want to do is we want to articulate or at least explain the difference between a traffic stop and an investigatory stop. An investigatory stop is a stop where an officer believes, or reasonably believes, based on reasonable articulable suspicion, sometimes referred to as RAS, that a crime is occurring, has occurred, or is about to occur. Officers are allowed to make stops under that reasonable articulable suspicion standard, and then investigate their suspicion based on those specific facts and the implications from those facts to determine whether or not a crime is being committed or not, to dispel or confirm those suspicions based on a reasonableness standard. A traffic stop is a little bit more specific than that. It's a vehicle stop of a driver specifically for a traffic violation, a vehicle code violation, or a parking violation, a licensing or equipment compliance violation. So anything that has to do with that vehicle, we're conducting a stop of that vehicle would be considered a traffic stop. However, there are vehicle stops that are not traffic stops. So if there's a vehicle that is wanted for a robbery, or a vehicle that just participated in a carjacking, that would be a stop of a vehicle, but that would be an investigatory stop because we're actually investigating or have reasonable articulable suspicion that a crime might be occurring using that vehicle. Traffic stops are based on probable cause or an observed violation of a traffic law. You can go on to the next slide, please. We also want to make sure that we have clear standards in our policy in terms of guidelines on how to conduct traffic stops and what the department expectations are. We want to make sure that we're not using traffic stops in a way where we're implementing quotas or promotions or anything are based on the number of traffic stops, and they're not incentivized in any way. We want to make sure there's fair and equitable treatment. There's no bias in conducting traffic stops. There's specific prohibitions on racial profiling or conducting stops based on a protected class. Like we've talked about a lot of the friction point is the interaction between the officer and the community member during that stop. We want to make sure we treat all people with courtesy and dignity, make sure it's a respectful interaction, make sure it's a professional interaction, and to make sure that those stops aren't any longer or extended beyond what we need to do to actually conduct business during that traffic stop. And then, like I mentioned, the prohibition against racial profiling. We can't use factors such as race, ethnicity, gender identity to initiate that traffic stop. That traffic stop needs to be based on probable cause that that vehicle and that driver committed a traffic violation to conduct that traffic stop. And then, like most of our other accountability measures and our interactions just in general, we want to make sure those interactions are recorded. So our traffic stops will be recorded on body cam, and if the vehicle is equipped with an in-car camera system, it will be documented on that in-car camera system. Next slide, please. There's some other provisions that we want to make sure we're clear in this policy to set up the expectations, not only of our officers, but of the community members. The policy requires that our officers are clearly identifiable as CPD officers, whether that's a marked squad car, whether that's being in uniform, whether that's having an identification, having their star and embroidered patch identifiable. We want to make sure that community members know it's a Chicago police officer that's conducting this traffic stop. Additionally, we got to make sure we're documenting those stops fully. Every stop needs to be documented, consistent with the Traffic and Pedestrian Stop Statistical Study, which is a statute in the Illinois Vehicle Code. We got to make sure we're documenting those fully, documenting them completely and truthfully. And also, we got to hold our officers accountable for those actions during that training. Like we mentioned before, there are policies existing on complaint and disciplinary, about interactions, about misconduct. We got to make sure our officers are not only following the traffic stop policy, but all of the other policies during the stop, and make sure that we provide after action support, additional training, or if necessary, progressive discipline to ensure that our officers are held accountable to those standards. And then we provided guidance to our officers in this policy on how to conduct that traffic stop, in particular, those specific actions we talked about, how to communicate with people during a traditional traffic stop in terms of procedural justice and legitimacy, and then what additional steps you need to do when we're communicating to remove people from vehicles or to handcuff people during vehicles or to conduct consent searches during that traffic stop. We got to make sure that we're communicating appropriately and fully to the community member during that stop. Next slide. Like we talked about consent searches, an officer without this policy can ask for consent to search on a traffic stop. That's something that happens now. We looked at that. We heard from the community. We go, we want to make sure that our officers have a reason to ask for that consent. We got to make sure there's a reason other than that traffic stop that the officer is asking for that consent search. So we identified in our policy that we need the officers pursuant to this policy need to act on specific articulable information regarding suspected criminal activity other than the activity of the traffic stop in order to ask for consent. And it also creates guidance on consent ultimately during that traffic stop. Consent has to be given in order for that officer to conduct that search. Officer has to articulate the scope of that search based on that consent. And the community member can always limit that scope or revoke consent entirely and stop that search. And that officer needs to abide by that revocation or that request to stop that search. So all those requirements that make consent searches lawful are outlined in our policy to make sure that we're following that, we're communicating those steps, and our officers are acting accordingly, and that we document that stop and that consent search not only on body cam, but on our traffic stop reports. Next slide, please. And then our officers, they need to conduct the stops. They need to document those stops, but ultimately our supervisors are held accountable as well. Supervisors need to be supervisors. They need to document and supervise their officers while they're in the field. And they also have to do those supervisory review of those reports consistent with what they do for other incidents at CPD. So CPD supervisors will review those submitted stop reports that officers report or that complete for traffic stops, and we'll make sure they're done by the end of the shift. So if there is any feedback, is there any critique or any necessity for any modification to those reports based on that supervisory review, there's timely feedback to that officer. We're going to document that. We talked about earlier about the development of that police encounters in the Fourth Amendment suite of policies. Part of that process was developing with the independent monitoring team a stop application to electronically capture investigatory stops. Well, traffic stops are going to be rolled into that. So we will be able to document that electronically to ensure we're capturing all the data that we need to capture for those stops. And that data will be used in our analysis. We'll report it out annually and will be used in those policy development conversations and those policy review conversations. Like I mentioned earlier, we're committing to reviewing this policy every 2 years to make sure that comprehensive review, and we will seek community input, including through the CCPSA, consistent with what we do for some of our other major policies, like use of force, like investigatory stops. We want to get the feedback from the community, how these policies are impacting the community in the field, how they're being related. We want to make sure that our policies are reflective of what we're hearing now, and then in 2 years to make sure that we're still reflective of the experiences of the people in the community. And I think that's my last slide for now, Cody, right?
Yeah, thank you so much, Lieutenant Kapistanik. Appreciate that. We will, like I said, continue to put your Q&A in the Q&A section, and we will attempt to get to as many questions as possible. Ones we can't answer that we don't get to, we'll make sure that we either get to them in another format, whether it be posting the frequently asked questions on our website or some other method. So thanks again. I just ask that we mute all the panelists. Thank you. All right, so if you go to the advance to the next slide, so much like Lieutenant Kapistanik kicked off, our response can be found here at this QR code, and I'll just go over some of the big aspects of the majority commissioner's differences with the current policy. Although, as I stated at the beginning, commissioners like Chicagoans have a range of views of what should be included in a comprehensive and effective traffic stop policy. and a majority of commissioners at this moment think that CPD's policy should be revised in several important ways that I'll cover now. Would you advance to the next 2 slides, please? Thanks. Next one. Thank you very much. So the one big way in which the commission has differs from the current policy is that a majority of commissioners support including restrictions for certain types of traffic stops, including some license plate violations, a missing front plate, improper fastening, meaning, if it's in the back of the window versus on the bumper, improper rear plate illumination. There's also a majority of commissioners support limiting traffic stops for registration stickers that have expired within a certain time frame, in this case, a year. Also, they support limiting stops for one functional headlight, taillight, brake light, or operating a vehicle with a loud sound system. So the majority of commissioners that also support within those limitations exceptions to those limitations. So there's a majority of commissioners that propose there's sort of two main proposals around what those limitations might be. One is that a minority of the majority support that a stop could be made if the CPD officer has RAS, or reasonable articulable suspicion, that Lieutenant Kapistanik defined earlier, of either a Class A misdemeanor or felony, with the exception of the cannabis law that recently passed. And then there's another group of commissioners that support exceptions to the limitations where one of those limited stops can only be made if there's an immediate threat to public safety or suspicion of a crime connected with that limited traffic stop that was on the previous slide. Move to the other area where commissioners, the majority of commissioners differ from the current draft traffic stop policy is around stronger standards for consent searches. So a majority of commissioners currently propose a higher threshold for when an officer can conduct a consent search. Lieutenant Kapistanik already talked about, before CPD did not have any guidance around that consent search. A traffic stop could happen and an officer could ask for consent. So the current policy that CPD has drafted has added a layer of suspicion that an officer must have before they can ask for a consent search. The majority commissioners support strengthening those standards even more. Again, we have there's two different ideas of how that consent search standard should be strengthened. One group of commissioners believes that three commissioners propose replacing specific articulable information, which is the draft standard that CPD has, with a higher standard of reasonable articulable suspicion or probable cause. And three other commissioners propose replacing specific articulable information with a standard of reasonable articulable suspicion or probable cause of a Class A misdemeanor or felony. So in both cases, those would change that stop to something more elevated. And that's what a majority of commissioners currently support, language around that. A majority of commissioners, also with regards to consent searches, a majority of commissioners want to eliminate consent searches. Right now in the current draft policy, it talks about a driver could volunteer to have a consent search or volunteer to have a search of their vehicle. Majority of commissioners want to eliminate that idea of a driver voluntarily offering to search their car without a request from an officer. Additionally, a majority of commissioners at this point support requiring consent searches have signatures from both the driver and the officer, and that whatever that the officer and the driver would be signing would include the reason for the search. Another area where a majority of commissioners support, oh, sorry, thanks, Scott. there's some additional changes that I'll just go over, sort of broadly speaking, although I really encourage people to look at both the memo and the markup to see some of the specific suggestions and policy language revisions that majority of commissioners have made. I'd also really stress that people look at the memo to see where some of the minority positions are at this moment in time as well, because there's a lot of rich information in there too to help people understand what commissioners are weighing as they're looking at this policy language. So some of the additional changes that have been recommended are around some definitions. There's some commissioners that support changing or adding additional definitions, deleting particular language. There's some language in the policy that currently talks about lawful traffic stops, and a majority of commissioners have suggested striking that word lawful where it occurs in the current policy. There's also, let's see here, a majority of commissioners support revising some of the policy guidance, but they're really divided on this. So in one group of commissioners support adding language around the guidance around policy stops and this is this idea of like when officers are making a decision to make a traffic stop and balancing for the public safety outcomes of that stop versus the issues and concerns that can happen when someone's stopped and how that impacts them and their community. So 3 commissioners support adding language that says officers can make stop for vehicle violations and license compliant violations only when a CPD member believes the violation significantly interferes with public safety. And another group of commissioners within that majority support language that says that officers can make pretextual stops and stops listed in that list of restrictions I said that we talked about earlier, only when an officer has reasonable articulable suspicion of a Class A misdemeanor or felony. Throughout the document, again, encouraging you to look at it, throughout the document, a majority of commissioners really support that CPD members, when making traffic stops, state the public safety purpose for that traffic stop. And one suggestion or one support is around ensuring that the stop report includes the public safety purpose for that traffic stop, so that an officer would document why they thought that stop needed to be done for a public safety reason. Some other areas that the majority of commissioners support changes within the current policy language are around a creation of a traffic stop dashboard. So a little more, there is right now, if I again encourage you to read the policy as it currently stands, there is a lot of additional elements of transparency in the data and transparency section, including annual reports and some other analysis that would really give some insight into traffic stops. But the commission also would really like to see a creation of a traffic stop dashboard codified in the policy. Right now, that language isn't in there, although, like I said, there is a lot of other language that I encourage you to look at and provide feedback on. And then a majority of commissioners propose a more robust role for the commission in some of the biannual policy review that Lieutenant Kapistanik spoke about, the annual data analysis, some of the trainings, and certainly the community engagement. So commissioners this majority group of commissioners have advocated for, like I said, a more robust spelling out of the commission's role in that and CCPSA's role in those reviews. So those are the majority positions and how they differ. I'll just say a little bit about what's next. And then we can go into the Q&A. I know some are already stacked up, so thank you so much. I encourage you to use the Q&A feature, not the comment feature, for your questions. So as we said, CPD and the commission have submitted these policies, the draft policy and the markup version to the Attorney General and the Monitor, beginning our phase 2 process, which will continue to include public review and engagement. We continue to work with with CPD. We continue to talk with folks about how the traffic stops will be potentially rolled into the consent decree or covered by the consent decree. We'll also continue to advocate for policies that are rooted in input and data. And then at the end of phase 2, which is still up in the air as to the specific date or the specific time in which phase 2 will end, but we will continue to collect information and policy suggestions in earnest. If the city of Chicago and the Attorney General have an agreement about traffic stop policy within the consent decree, the CCPSA and CPD will continue to be involved in figuring out the best policy for people in Chicago. We also, it should be noted, will also publish a summary report of all the engagement findings, including key recommendations and policy implications. So I encourage you all to, remain engaged. We have a new phase 2 feedback form on our website, which is really more about getting feedback about specific policy language. So the feedback form, if you completed it in phase 1, thank you. That was more about your experience with traffic stops. This phase 2 feedback form is really more about your reflections on the policy language, your concerns, your questions, anything you think might be missing. So really encourage you to do that. We've also, a shout out to our district councils. We gave a webinar earlier around traffic stop policy to our district counselors, who I know are boots on the ground, grounded in their community, talking with folks that they serve around traffic stop policy. So we're excited to hear back from district counselors about what they're hearing from their constituents. And of course, we'll be sharing that with CPD as we continue to work on policy together. And just one quick reflection before we move into questions. We're really trying to make sure this is transparent process. So we're working, like I said, on trying to get some of this stuff posted so that people can see the themes and some of the information we're receiving. We're really trying to ground our process in hearing from the community and ground it in community voice, and really try to incorporate what we hear from people who are directly impacted by traffic stops. So we continue to center ourselves with those. And then finally, balancing, thinking always of balance, that the commission recognizes that the safety of officers and residents matter, and a policy must reflect both of those considerations in earnest. So I will stop there. I'm going to, open the Q&A, and what we'll do there, thank you for all of you who've put questions in the Q&A.
Cody, if you want, I can just read them and kind of have you guys respond if that works for you.
That'd be great.
I'm going to start with the most common question we've had, which is from Brianna, and Sarah asked, will these slides be made available to attendees?
Yeah, yes, I believe so. I noticed some editing tweaks in them, but yes, we will make those available. I'll check with our with CPD as well to make sure that's okay with them, but we'll make them available.
All right, the next one would actually be for Lieutenant Kapistanik. And the question is, how does the CPD's proposed traffic stops policy differ from what is currently being done by members of the Chicago Police Department?
Yeah, thanks for the question. That's actually a really good question. I mean, obviously, we're developing a policy to inspire some change in behavior in terms of the interaction during these traffic stops. Now, obviously, like we talked about earlier, a lot of the policy is consistent with either law or other policies that we have in place in terms of that interaction, in terms of respectful treatment, in terms of constitutionality of the stops. But see, this draft policy goes further in being really prescriptive on some of those traffic stop requirements, like being clearly identifiable as an officer, making that a statement in policy, having officers consider the legitimate law enforcement or safety benefit when we're conducting those stops, to make those discretionary decisions that make stops. And then, like we talked about in terms of removing people from vehicle, requesting consent, or other actions like that, we're really prescriptive that goes beyond what case law might say in those particular circumstances, to ensure our officers are conducting these stops and conducting these actions respectfully, professional, constitutionally, and make sure that these communication requirements are outlined in policy. That's all new in terms of policy prescriptions. You know, we train officers on traffic stops, officers get experience, but this is the first time a lot of those provisions are in policy to make sure that those respectful interactions take place. And then, like I talked about earlier, all those commitments on the back end, putting a policy commitment to review these policies, a policy commitment to do a traffic stop analysis, to look at that data, a policy commitment to engage the community, a policy commitment to train our officers. Those are all new. Those are all differing standards where we want to make sure that our commitment to those are articulated and clarified in the policy to show that we're committed to getting this policy right.
Excellent. Thank you for that. You know, the next question, actually, I'm going to stick with you, Lieutenant Capistana. Could you talk a little bit about how this will interact with what consent? You know, we know that from myriad sources that the Chicago Police Department is continuing to work on getting to compliance with the consent decree as is. You know, given that this will interact with the consent decree, can you talk a little bit about that? Is there, you know, where is the Chicago Police Department on its current level of compliance, and how will this affect that?
Yeah, I'll talk a little bit in general about the consent decree and about compliance. I don't want to take up too much time on that. But just a really basic, you know, consent decree 101. In the consent decree, there are 3 levels of compliance. It's preliminary compliance, secondary compliance, and operational compliance. And basically what that means is step 1 is CPD has to have a policy requiring this provision of the consent decree, requiring certain actions by officers, by the department, by certain units to produce certain reports. There's a policy requirement for that. And in that aspect, we're over 92, we're about 90, over 90%, about 92% compliance in that aspect. And then when you implement a new policy or you draft a new policy, then you have to train officers on it or train our entire police department, which might include the civilian employees as well. That training is a significant undertaking as well in terms of making sure that all of our officers get the training. Our officers get 40 hours, a minimum of 40 hours a year of in-service training. And you got to make sure that those new policies we're developing are trained not only to existing officers, but to new officers. So that training takes some effort as well. And we're over 50% compliant there. And then the number of people like to talk about a lot is operational compliance. Now, after a policies development, after officers are trained, now we look at operational compliance. Is there an impact? Are we performing these actions in the field after that policy change and after the training? And that's where CPD continues to make improvements, continues to drive towards getting that compliance number up. And at the last reporting period, that operational compliance percentage was around 16%. So it's a stepped-in process. And to get compliance, you can't, you know, day one have all the policies in place, all the training in place, and feeling that impact. So, you know, it's a process, and we're getting into that process, but we're working our way through all those levels. And then in terms of traffic stops are not yet within the consent decree. But if they do get put into the consent decree, it would be the same levels of compliance that we would have to work through. We have to work through consistent with the provisions of the consent decree. We would work through the policy development with CCPSA, with the independent monitoring team and the Office of the Attorney General. We would do the same with training, and then on evaluating how those policies are being implemented in the field.
Thanks for that. Director Stevens, there was a question of whether or not individual positions from each of the commissioners is laid out in the memorandum. Could you just talk a little bit about the format of that? And
Sure. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, the memorandum, response memorandum does include where all the various commissioners stand on the different positions. So the memorandum has that specificity. I'd also say I do think it's sort of in response to some questions I'm seeing. The Commissioners Wortham and Terry are part of the policy working group and have been working really diligently on with CPD around this policy language. And I believe I saw at least one of them on this call. And so, yeah, they've been really working on this and have intimate knowledge of where we're going. The memo like I said, it does have the individual commissioner positions. So does the markup policy of where different commissioners stand on the response to the current draft policy. I will say the commission hasn't voted on this. So the commission position is, we don't have a commission position as of yet because the commission hasn't voted yet on this policy. So that's where, so that's why we talk about majority commission position, because various commissioners sit in different places on different aspects of the policy.
So I'm gonna stick with you, Director Stevens. So one question we got is, some commissioners have suggested that they would like CPD members not to make traffic stops for certain categories of traffic offense, and the question is, why do that in a policy, and why not change the law at the state level? Why have commissioners opted to instead do it through this mechanism?
Well, the commission doesn't have, this is one of the commission's powers, is to work on policy with CPD. The commission doesn't have sort of that state mandate. So it's one reason. It is a way that some jurisdictions, like I said, the commission talked with lots of different jurisdictions who have reformed or overhauled their traffic stop policy. Some have done it through legislation, some have done it through policy, some have done it through superintendent direction. So there's been lots of different ways it's been done, but the commission's power right now is around policy development and working with CPD to put traffic policy in place that is reflective of the various folks we talked to.
So next question is for Lieutenant Kapistanik. And the question here is that there has been some reporting about that traffic stops have been underreported to the Illinois Traffic and Pedestrian Stops Study. What does the proposed policy do to help address the problems that led to that underreporting? And how will CPD make sure that all stops are fully reported to state regulators? And what consequences would there be if they don't?
Yeah, thanks for that question. And obviously, CPD is aware of the reporting of the conflicting numbers, and not looking at this policy, but looking back, we're looking into that. We're looking at what causes that discrepancies, what we can do to adjust for those discrepancies, working with other city agencies on making sure there's alignment in that reporting. And that's one of the things that this new draft policy does. It makes sure that when we do the analysis, the annual analysis of our traffic stop data, that data from other city agencies, such as the Office of Emergency Management and Communications, OEMC, which does our dispatching, to make sure that if there's a discrepancy between our numbers and their numbers in the policy, that it's identified, and we work to correct that. And we work to identify what the causes of that for. Is it technology? Is it training? Is it supervision? Is it accountability? Is it reporting? So part of that analysis that we've committed to in that annual report looks to get to the root of that problem, similarly to what we're trying to do now to identify causes of that discrepancy.
Great. We have two questions left for you, Lieutenant Kapistanik, and then one that I have a hunch you both might want to weigh in on. So I'm just gonna, so the next one is, many of those impacted by traffic stops asked for more involvement of police with their communities. What measures are being taken to ensure this? CPD is CPD committed to community policing? And we know in this asker is commenting that DCOs are assigned away from their duties to work beats. How is CPD going to ensure that there is strong community involvement with traffic stops and without?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I mean, we're obviously doing that in a couple ways. I mean, obviously, we've been part of these conversations with the commission. We appreciate the commission inviting us in to participate in this. We're doing our own outreach in terms of the community and around this traffic stop policy. But in community policing in general, we have outside partners that are working on a community policing evaluation for the department to ensure that our resources are aligned and the commitment that the superintendent has made, the community policing can still be maintained. And we also have a workforce allocation assessment that's going on. There's community engagement around that as well to make sure that we can clearly articulate, clearly define what the roles of all of our personnel and our employees are, to make sure that we're committing the time and resources to those things that are important to the community.
All right. So the next question is, in the policy, I know that it talks a little bit about officers being readily identifiable as members of the Chicago Police Department. For officers who are not in a white shirt as you are, or a blue shirt for officers, for folks who are on a TAC team or some other tactical team or some other role where they're maybe in a casual dress or a less uniform dress, how would they be identified as members of the police department?
Yeah, thanks. That's a good question. And quite honestly, our policies for appearance and uniform and dress aren't limited to our uniforms. Obviously, the most easily identifiable component of a CPD officer is our uniform, and we have policies on how the uniform looks and how officers wear that. But we also have policies in place that our non-uniform members need to follow, whether they're in a civilian dress capacity or a conservative business attire capacity. There are protocols there as well, like the outer vest carrier with the embroidered name plate, star, and back patch for police to make sure that the outermost garment has those identifiers on it. There are things like that are in our policy to make sure that our officers are easily identifiable in terms of other uniform configurations, but all that's already prescribed in our policy that not only addresses uniforms, but also personal appearance and other types of dress.
So we have 2 questions remaining, and I think they actually both touch on very similar things. And I'm actually going to ask both of you to respond to them if you don't mind. And the first is a question about the Supreme Court ruling in Wren versus the United States, which kind of sets the groundwork for these sorts of traffic stops. And I think the question that I'm seeing here is, there's a second question here that is basically, would CPD members not be following city or state law that has been set if the policy is more restrictive than whatever law has been set out for traffic enforcement in the state of Illinois? And I actually see these 2 questions as really related, because Supreme Court precedent or city and state ordinance and law, I think the questions here are really getting at, is it okay or how does the policy that is more restrictive than what has been established in the Supreme Court or what is written in state and city ordinance and law, how does that interact? And I guess I'm leaving this a little open-ended in hopes that, you guys can speak to both of these kind of concerns that folks have. And either of you, Cody,
Sure.
you are muted. You want to go first?
Yeah, sure. Well, the first, I think Mike would say what Lieutenant Capistanek talked about earlier. There's this 4th Amendment policy suite that the traffic stop policy will be nested within this bigger suite of policies that talks extensively about the 4th Amendment. So to Mike's earlier point about, like, this policy doesn't exist by itself. So it's part of a bigger suite of policies that spell out those different protections. I'll let Mike talk sort of more specifically about that. But then the second question, thanks for that second question. No, I'm definitely not saying that the commission has the power to direct CPD to not follow laws. The commission's work with CPD is really about understanding what the laws are, understanding what the current policy is, looking at other places and how they've improved policies both for their community and officers. And so that's really more about, it's not so much about our power to do it, it's about the way in which we try to both strike that balance that I talked about earlier, like strike the balance of hearing from CPD and what they're looking to do with the policy, and then also hearing from community and understanding what they're looking to do with the policies. So yeah, so the commission's, as far as powers go, I'm talking about the commission and the ordinance. One of our ordinance responsibilities is to work with CPD around policies. That was more, I think, what I was saying, not so much around powers, but around our duties in that under the ordinance. Yeah, go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, no, and just really quick, because I know we're running up on time. I mean, the way the policy interacts with the 4th Amendment, you hit it right on point, that it's part of this suite to make sure that we're protecting 4th Amendment rights of the members of the community when we're conducting these stops. And really the other prescriptive policy requirements are really to ensure and ingrain those respectful professional stops and that professional, respectful treatment grounded in procedural justice. So it's really not, to your point, supersede, but it's really providing context and clarity to make sure that those interactions truly are professional, respectful, and without bias.
Thanks so much, Lieutenant Capistanek. Thank you so much, Scott, for running through those questions. We'll post this webinar and we will share it out with all the people who attended. Thank you so much, doubling down on the appreciation for spending a Tuesday night with us. I know people's schedules are busy. This isn't the end of our outreach, or hopefully this isn't the end of our conversations with people. Use the QR codes. We will post this up so you can get to either CPD's website or our website, or both. And we look forward to hearing from all of you. Great appreciation to CPD for continuing to work with us. And thank you so much in particular to Lieutenant Capistanek for taking the time to talk about the specifics of the current draft policy. So thank you all, and have a great evening.
Take care. Thank you very much. Have a good night.